Hi everybody, we'll be talking about chapter 8 lesson 3 plant reproduction in today's session. I hope that you are having your books with you, so you're taking notes, and if there is any question please feel free to ask. Okay, starting up with the lesson. You know that plants can reproduce either asexually or sexually, or they can reproduce both ways. Asexual reproduction occurs when a portion of a plant develops into a separate new plant. This new plant is genetically identical to the original or parent plant. Some plants such as irises and daylilies can use their underground stems for asexual reproduction. Other plants such as the house leeks or hens and chicks they can reproduce asexually using horizontal stem called stolons. Now one advantage of asexual reproduction is that just one parent organism can produce offspring. However, sexual reproduction in plant usually requires two parent organisms. Sexual reproduction occurs when the plant's sperm combines with the plant egg, and this results in zygote, and then the zygote can grow into a new plant. Coming up to alternation of generation, as you know, your body is made up of two types of cells, haploid and the diploid cells. We studied this in our previous semester. Most of your cells are diploid. The only human haploid cells are sperm and eggs. Now, as a result, you will have you live your entire life as a diploid organism. To put it another way, your life cycle includes only a diploid stage. That isn't true for all organisms. Some organisms, include plants, have two life stages called generations. One generation is almost all diploid cells. The other generation has only haploid cells. Alternation of generation occurs when the life cycle of an organism alternates between diploid and haploid generations, as you can see here. Now, the diploid generation, when you look at tree or flower, you are seeing a part of plant's diploid generation. Meiosis occur in certain cells in the reproductive structure of a diploid plant. The daughter cells produced from haploid structures are called spores. Spores grow by mitosis and cell division and form the haploid generation of a plant. On the other hand, the haploid generation, in most plants, the haploid generation is tiny and lives surrounded by tissues of diploid plant. In other plants, the haploid generation lives on its own. Certain reproductive cells of the haploid generation reproduce haploid sperms or eggs by mitosis and cell division. Fertilization, takes place when a sperm and egg fuse and form a diploid zygote. Through mitosis and cell division, the zygote grows into the diploid generation of a plant. You can see this here clearly in this table. Diploid zygote changing into diploid plant, then meiosis, then a haploid spores into haploid plant. We have the sperm and egg and fertilization, and this process keeps on going. Now, coming to the reproduction in seedless plants. First, we talk about the life cycle of moss. The life cycle of moss is typical for some seedless plants. The tiny green moss plants that carpet roots, bark, and soil and moist areas are haploid plants. These plants grow by mitosis and cell division from haploid spores produced by the diploid generation. They have a male structure that produce sperm and the female structures that produce eggs. Fertilization results in diploid zygote that grows by mitosis and cell divisions into diploid generation of moss. Now, a diploid moss is tiny and not easily seen. You can see here gametophyte, okay, and then it's changing into sporophyte. Then the capsules, the spores are ready and grown up. So this is the life cycle of a moss. Coming to life cycle of a fern. An alternation of generations also seen in life cycle of a fern. The diploid generations are green leafy plants often seen in forests. These plants actually produce haploid spores. The spores grow into tiny plants, and the haploid plants produce eggs and sperms that can unite and form the diploid generations. So this was the life cycle of non-seeding plants, the moose, and life cycle of fern plant. Now, how seeds plants reproduce? Most land plants that cover earth go from seeds. There are two groups of seeding plants. We have the flowering plants and non-flowering plants. Unlike seedless plants, the haploid generation of seed plant is within diploid tissue. So separate diploid male and diploid female reproductive structures produce haploid sperms and haploid eggs that join during fertilization. We have the role of pollen grain. A pollen grain forms from tissue in a male reproductive structure of a seed plant. Each pollen grain contains nutrients and has a hard reproductive outer covering. Pollen grains, as you can see here, they produce sperm cells. Wind, animals, gravity, or water currents can carry pollen grains to female reproductive structures. Now, plants cannot move and find a mate as strong as most animals can. Now, if you remember reading about the yellow dust, sometimes you see when there's spring in your country and you see that dust mostly on the cars and on the land, that dust is actually pollen grains. Most reproductive structures, a vast number of are the pollen grains. Pollination occurs when pollen grain lands on a female reproductive structure of a plant that is the same species as the pollen grains. The role of ovule and seeds. The female reproductive structure of a seed plant where the haploid egg develops is called the ovule. Following pollination, sperm enters the ovule and fertilization occurs. When the sperm enters there, a zygote forms and develops into an embryo, which is an immature diploid plant that develops from the zygote. Now, an embryo, its food supply and protective covering makes up the seed. A seed then, food supply provides the embryo with nourishment for its early growth. Then you have the reproduction in flowerless. Now we come how actually reproduction happens in flowerless plants and flowering plants. So flowerless seed plants are also known as gymnosperms. The word gymno actually means naked seed, or gymnosperm seeds are actually not considered or not surrounded by a fruit. The most common gymnosperms are conifers such as pines and many of the trees and shrubs with needle-like or scale-like leaves. Most conifers are evergreens, which mean that they have leaves all year long. Conifers can live for many years. For example, here are bristlecone pines, such as you can see here. They have the oldest living tree on earth. That's the figure 18 in your book, if you can see the picture of bristlecone pine tree. Here we have a life cycle of flowering plant, the life cycle of flowerless plant. The life cycle of a gymnosperm includes alternation of generation. You have the cones, are the male and the female reproductive structure of conifers. They contain the haploid generation. Male cones are small, papery structure that produce pollen grains. Female cones can be woody, berry-like, or soft, and they produce eggs. A zygote forms when a sperm from a male cone fertilizes an egg. The zygote is the beginning of the diploid generation. Seeds forms as part of the female cone. So this is the reproduction in flowerless plants, as you can see here in this life cycle. Coming to reproduction in flowering seed plants. Most plants you see around you are the angiosperms, which means the flowering plants. Fruits and vegetables come from angiosperms. Many animals depend on angiosperms for food. The flower is the reproduction of an angiosperm begins in a flower. Most flowers have male and female reproductive structures. As you can see here, the male part stamen. You have the female part as pistil. The male part contains anther and filament. The female part pistil has stigma, style, and ovary. You have the ovules. Now the male reproductive organ of flower is called the stamen. Pollen grains from the tip of the stamen and anther, and the filament supports the anther and connects the tip of the stamen in the anther. Now the filament supports the anther and connects it to the base of the flower. The female reproduces organ of a flower. Now the female part is called the pistil. Pollen can land at the tip of the pistil, and then or stigma, and then the stigma is at the top of the long tube called the style. At the base of the style is the ovary, which contains one or more ovules. If you remember, ovule eventually will contain a haploid egg and might become a seed if fertilized. So this is the parts of the male and female in a flower. Now reproduction in flowering seeding plants. A typical life cycle of an angiosperm, as you can see here, pollen grains travel by wind, or they can be carried by water or animal from the anther to the stigma, where pollination occurs. After pollination occurs, you have the pollen tube grows from the pollen into the stigma, down the style, okay, to the ovary at the base of the pistil. Now the sperm here develops from a haploid cell into a pollen tube. When the pollen tube enters an ovule, fertilization takes place. You can see here. Now, as we studied earlier, that zygote that results from fertilization develops into an embryo. So after an embryo is formed, each ovule in its embryo will become a seed. The ovary and sometimes other parts of the flower will develop into a fruit that contains one or more seeds. The seeds can grow into new genetically related plants that produce flowers, and this cycle then keeps on going. So this is the reproduction in flowering seed plants. Now fruits and seed dispersal. Fruits and seeds such as we can see here are important sources of food for people and animals. In most cases, seeds of flowering plants are inside fruits. Pods of the fruits, for example, you can see here different kind of fruits are there. Now we usually think of fruits are juicy and edible, such as oranges or watermelons. However, some fruits are hard, dry, and not particularly edible. For example, you have a dandelion, which is a dry fruit. Now fruits help protect seeds and disperse them. Some fruits, such as those of dandelion, are light and float on air current, which helps to scatter the seed. Also, when an animal eats fruit, the fruit seed can pass through the animal's digestive system with little or no damage to the seed, and then the animal, it goes through his digestive system and it may land in a good spot where conditions are good, and it can become a new plant. So this means that animals also help to disperse the seed away from one place to another place Wind can do that, animals can do that. Animals include insects also, you know, they are good pollinators of pollen also. Or birds, for example, can eat fruits and then they can digest the seed and a new plant can occur, can grow up. Thank you for watching. Hopefully this helps. We've finished this lesson also. You're supposed to do your homework in the workbook and the lesson review, and attach them to the Pioneer on email and send it to your teachers. We will be I'll send you the answers when we by tomorrow. Thank you very much once again.